Hey everyone, it's Age here. So I'm going to try my hand at my first tutorial. I would have included the line art, but I didn't think until after I was done to actually use this project sort of to figure this out. So in this case, I'm just going to do some coloring for you. So we have our line art layer, which is, let me rename that. And I usually do all of the colors on around a single layer. And then there's just the sketch layer in the back. I usually sketch with black and then lower it down. I'm using Fire Alpaca, but a lot of this is very straightforward in any program. So this is just basically how I do it. The first thing I do is basically select everywhere around the character that isn't colored in. Then I invert that selection and I just fill it all in with white like this. An important thing to know about color is, okay, in Fire Alpaca, there's this little thing over here called Protect Alpha. I always turn that on because this is how it looks off. If I were to color, it would go for everything, but if I click Protect Alpha on, it'll only color on parts of that layer that have already been filled in or whatever. So now that that's done, I'm just going to grab my colors. And I'm also using this as an excuse to draw Sunset in her Canon colors versus the brighter colors that I usually do. And I usually just fill them in. I have my fill tool set to reference the entire canvas instead of the layer itself. So while this is coloring on the color layer, it's utilizing the line art layer to sort of separate the colors out, so I'm not just filling the whole white thing in. So I just make sure to get every hole. And actually with the hair, I'm going to do that next. What I do is I make a new layer. Let's just call it hair for now. And I apply a clipping mask over top of the color layer. So basically make a layer over top of your color layer, and right next to Protect Alpha you're going to see clipping, so click that. And what that does is basically the same thing as Protect Alpha does, except it's on a new layer. So if I were to draw her hair, it would show up, but if I switch this off, it'll go over everything, so you can turn that on and off depending on how you want. Okay, so for the hair, I just fill it in where it needs to be. Fill up any holes that you want to. And then to add the yellow to her hair, you hit Protect Alpha. In this case, it'll only color over the red, so you don't even need to worry about it going over, sorry, I don't know why my program is doing it, over to her coat color. Basically, I just use a smaller brush and draw it in, and then I just fill it where it needs to go. And in Fire Alpaca, you can swipe between the two different colors by pressing X, like I'm doing here right now. It's just a faster way to go through everything. Also, don't worry about drawing as fast as me, because it's a thing that generally comes up when I try and teach people to draw, but I've been doing this stuff for at least 10 years, so it just takes time to figure out a good speed for yourself. I generally need to draw a little bit faster because I'm an animator, and there's a specific workflow that goes in with doing that. Okay, so our hair's done. Usually what I do is I merge the hair and the color all onto one layer. You can, draw a cutie mark or not. I usually just copy and paste a vector onto her. And then I merge that too. You don't have to merge all the colors, but that's usually what I like doing. Okay, now we're going to get onto the shading, which is the most fun for me to do. So make a new layer, apply a clipping mask, and just draw white completely over everything. This part you don't really need to do, but I like doing it so that the colors underneath don't get in the way when I'm trying to fill some stuff in. The important part here is to remember to make a new layer. Let's call this shadows. And above the layers, you're going to see this thing called blending. These are just different modes for each layer that'll basically change how it's going to look overall. So for shading, you can do anything, but I usually set mine to multiply. I'll show you how it looks when I'm finished working around with it. But just make sure it's not the same as the white layer. That's really important. So usually what I do now is I pick sort of an kind of light, kind of dark-ish purple or pink color. I usually go somewhere in between. And then I just kind of go at it. I use the regular hard pen for everything though. And sometimes I will select parts of the drawing so that I could do like one swift movement without needing to worry about here, like where I'm adding shadow to her hair but not her horn. So I just basically fill stuff in where it needs to go. And I'm flipping between the eraser and the brush by pressing B and E. Or you can just click them on the side, but that's too much work for me. I like the keyboard shortcuts. Sometimes I add shadows into their eyes. Actually, I'll save that for later. And for the back legs, like on the show, I usually just fill it in and add a little light. You can technically shade with any color that you want, but I usually like going for blues or purples because, what's the wording? Like, blue basically recedes because it's a cooler color. Don't quote me on that, that's just the best wording that I could think of. Like, I do like shading in pink a lot, but even though that's not really a traditional shading color, I like the brighter colors, as you can probably tell. And actually I'll set this back to normal for now. So go back to your, actually don't click on your white layer, but hide your white layer, and you see how all of this purple is just kind of looks pretty ugly right now. To fix that, just set your blending load to multiply and see how different it looks. It just basically multiplies the color beneath it, and I don't really know exactly how it works, but it does. And then once you hide the white, I mean, you can delete the white layer if you want, but once you hide that, I just look and see how it looks. So this is just the base for your shading color. Once this is done, what I'm going to do is I usually go to the airbrush, not the 50, go to the one that says 100, the lighter looking one. I usually set it to anywhere from like 5 to 20 opacity, and I hike it up to 1,000 pixels. And then I just lightly brush just to give it a very subtle, airy look. I'm not really sure what to call it, but just to give it subtle so it's not just cell shading. Now this is the part that I really enjoy doing. So all your shadows are done and it looks good. So what we're going to do is go back to Protect Alpha, and we're going to click on that. This part can get a little intuitive. You don't have to do this part. I just like doing it to add some depth to my drawings. So I'm going to slightly drag the hue and make this color a little bit darker and bluer. You can change the airbrush to be a bit smaller. I usually keep it big because I have a very light hand, so I don't really need to worry about covering too much ground at once. And then I might make that a little smaller. Here we go, around 500. And then I just sort of lightly brush the darker areas, like under her neck and behind her hair and at the tops of her legs. And I don't really do a whole lot to this, just a little bit. And then I do the same thing, but in the opposite direction. So I make it a little bit redder and brighter. And like at the top of her hair, where her chest kind of curves, and maybe at the bottoms of her legs, just to kind of make the shadows more than one color. Okay, so once these are done and they look good, we're gonna go create a new layer, add a clipping mask, do this right over the shadows, and we're gonna call it highlights. The highlights, I always alternate on how many I'm gonna do. It really depends on the drawing. But I'm gonna stay with the airbrush and I'm gonna hike it up to 1,000 again. I usually put it on a lower opacity, around 7. Let me think. With Sunset, I usually try a lighter pink color, and you make sure your blending mode is on add. It's right below multiply. It basically does the opposite and it adds colors instead of multiplies it. That's basically it. It makes everything lighter and brighter. So this you have to be really careful because it can get a little, if you do too much, it won't really look good. So I make sure to put it on a low opacity and just kind of brush some areas, like some of the darker areas a little bit to give it sort of a bounce light. The lighter areas to kind of show a light source. And this one I do sometimes, but you don't have to. Once all of your airbrushing is done, I click the pencil tool, which is right below the pen. It's basically the same thing, except it fades depending on how much pressure you put on it. And then I just very subtly add some highlight, some more bounce light usually. And sometimes I usually do that to add a little light to their face. And I'll add some right over here to her hair. Also, don't be afraid to use more than one stroke, especially with your line art, but I'll get into that line art in another tutorial. I'll add one more on her leg. Alright, there we go, that's good enough. Okay, so her coloring is pretty much done. Now I'm going to show you how I do the eyes. The eyes are really, they're not as complex as you might think. So I'm going to stay zoomed in on this. I'm going to grab her eye color. Where is it? There we go. Okay. So I make a new layer above the line art. Don't do any clipping mask to it or anything. I'm going to call it eye base. So go back to your regular pen and just draw in the iris with whatever color your character's base color is, so it'll look something like this. Now make a new layer, add a clipping mask to it. I'm going to call it eyeshadow. Okay, so we're going to set this to multiply, and generally I'll try and grab a random color that has been used for the base color so far. That's partially why I like keeping this white layer, so I could just easily turn it on and off to snag the colors. So we're going to use the airbrush, a little bit over 100, and we're just going to go over focusing on the top part of her eye, so it kind of looks like it makes a gradient. And then I'm going to go to my eraser and just kind of erase the bottom part so that there's like two little circles. And next, I'll just usually use my own judgment with this. I'll just add some darker part to the shading at the top. Alright, now that this is done, we're going to make a new layer on top of eyeshadow, add a clipping mask and set it to multiply, and I'm going to name this pupil. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my eyedropper tool and pick at the very top of the eye, the darkest part. I'm going to go to my regular pen tool, and I'm just going to draw it in the center of the iris. Don't move it off to the side like that, because that's not realistic at all. The iris is always in the center of the eye. Hold on, I have to pause this for a minute. Okay, so we have our pupil drawn. They look pretty good. Now I just go back to the airbrush and slightly airbrush the top to make it even darker. And then what we're going to do is make a new layer over the pupil, add a clipping mask. I'm going to call it eye highlight. And we're going to set the blending mode to add again. Usually at this point I sort of color pick a portion of the eye, so we'll go with this blue color here. Keep the airbrush bigger than the eye, and we're just going to slightly brush the bottom. Actually, no, that's not a good color. I'll make it a little bit greener. So we're going to slightly airbrush the bottom. That looks good. And then we're going to go to our pencil tool right under the pen tool. Make it a little bit bigger, around 40 or 50. And just add a little bit of shine at the bottom of her eye. Make sure that the shine stays in where that light is right here, because it wouldn't make sense to have it shining in darkness. Alright, yeah, that's done. Actually, what we're going to do, what I forgot to do, is go back to the whites of her eyes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these. Make sure that you turn off the shadows and highlights when you select it so that it just selects the whole white of her eye. You don't need to select the pupils, but I usually like to. It doesn't really matter because you're not going to see it anyway. Alright, we're going to go to our shadows layer. And just do a little bit of airbrush at the top. Just so that it's not so jarring and white. Alright, now the last part, we're going to go to the very top layer, create a new layer, and we're going to call it Outshine. This is a lot of people's favorite part of my artwork, I guess. We're going to set the layer to add, do a pure white. We're not going to clip it to anything, we're just going to zoom in and just draw them in. You can move them however you want if you think one of them looks weird. There we go, that's better. Alright, that's it. I'm not really sure where to go now, but it's done. If you have any questions, just reply to the video, and I'll link to the final image and everything. I hope you liked it.